I think the thing about mom guilt is that a lot of times what we feel guilty about is not objectively wrong. In all honesty, sometimes it's just that we're just trying to choose the best possible option of the often limited options that we have.
Yo soy la madre, I'm the creator. Yo soy la reina, I am the maker. You can bow down now or bow down later. I don't need you to be my validator. I am the healer, la curandera. I'm starting fires, don't need madera. Deep as an ocean, light as a feather. Bring on the dragons, I am the slayer.
You're listening to Mom's New Identity Podcast. I'm your host, Amber Ivana, and on this podcast, we'll be discussing topics ranging from the realities and challenges of motherhood and raising a family, healing your inner child, and mental health, and last but certainly not least, tips and education around business and productivity so that you can turn your passions and purpose into a full-time career. Hello, and welcome back to Mom's New Identity Podcast. I'm your host, Amber Ivana, and today we're talking about a very, very, in my opinion, important topic, and that is mom guilt. If you're a mom and you're watching this podcast, I can only assume that you want to be the best possible mother, parent to your child. So it is very likely that you may have experienced mom guilt in some way, shape, or form. For those of you that aren't mothers, it's pretty self-explanatory. Mom guilt, it's more or less the feeling of just not doing enough or not being enough, not doing well enough. And today, I really want to unpack mom guilt and where that, in my opinion, comes from and how we can try and, I guess, let go of mom guilt and not let it plague us so much. So if you're listening, let's jump into it. So I'm just going to start off by pulling up the actual definition of the word guilty. I know that seems ridiculous, but hear me out. The definition of the word guilty is culpable of or responsible for a specified wrongdoing. So in other words, you're doing something wrong. Simple as that. I think that guilt isn't necessarily a negative emotion. It just depends on the context. I think guilt is an emotion that is meant to encourage us to face ourselves and recognize when we have harmed someone or when we have hurt someone. So I don't think guilt is a negative emotion. I think it's when we guilt ourselves for stuff that's not objectively wrong, that it can be problematic and ultimately lead to shame. Now, shame, we're going to Google that definition too, because, you know, I'm a logical person, okay? So I like to use, I like I said, I'm a logical person. So I'm very much about like, let me give you the exact definition so you can see where this comes from. Okay. So shame is a painful feeling of humiliation or distress caused by the consciousness of wrong or foolish behavior. So shame is ultimately the feeling that comes from the belief that you've been foolish or wrong. It's similar to embarrassment. It's just a little bit deeper than that. And that often comes from guilt. So guilt and shame are cousins or sisters, mother, child. I don't know. Whatever. So my reason for breaking all of that down, as simple as it is because when we stop and look at guilt or really any situation objectively, when we remove our emotions from it, again, y'all know that I'm a huge advocate for feeling your feelings and acknowledging what emotions you're experiencing. I don't think there's good or bad emotions. However, when we step away from a situation and we take whatever feelings we have associated with that situation and we look at it from a logical standpoint, a lot of times it's easier to see it for what it really is versus what your emotions, what your ego, what your inner child is telling you. Okay. So back to the topic of mom guilt. Mom guilt really comes just unnecessarily and quite honestly, very frequently. And sometimes it can be really debilitating to a point where it can put a mother into a really deep state of depression or anxiety. And I personally, again, like I said, have experienced mom guilt. But I think the thing about mom guilt is that a lot of times what we feel guilty about is not objectively wrong. In all honesty, sometimes it's just that we're just trying to choose the best possible option of the often limited options that we have. So just a simple example, I think a lot of moms, and I know I have experienced guilt over this, a lot of moms maybe feel guilty or ashamed or not enough if they are unable to breastfeed. Okay. And there's a lot of things that can determine whether or not you're able to breastfeed your child. If you have to go back to work and you don't have a job that is very accommodating, even though by law they do have to accommodate you if you're a breastfeeding mother, you're probably not always going to have the time to pump every 2 to 3 hours like you're supposed to maintain your milk supply. Not only that, there's a lot of things that go into that, right? Pumping it can be stressful. You know, if you're stressed about how much milk you're producing, that can also actually, oddly enough, hinder how much milk you create. So I don't want to get too much into the details of breastfeeding and such, but what I can say is that a mother who has to go back to work, doesn't have an accommodating workplace to be able to continue to pump, versus a mother who stays at home and is constantly with the child, obviously the mother that has to go back to work is going to have a lot more of a challenge being able to continue breastfeeding versus the mom that is still at home with her child. And when you look at it from that perspective, you can recognize that, you know what? The mom was trying to do everything she possibly can, but it's not like she can just up and quit her job, right? If a mom decides she has to stop pumping and breastfeeding and just goes on to formula, breastfeeding is not easy. Okay, it's stressful. Okay, there can maybe be feelings of like, oh, I'm not doing enough for my kid, and I personally have felt that way, right? That's really what mom guilt is. It's I'm not doing enough. I'm not doing enough. I'm not doing enough. But where does that belief come from that we're not doing enough? Think about it. Where does it come from? Well, what I believe it comes from is our conditioning, oftentimes as women, that we always need to be, in a sense, kind of proving that we're worthy, whether that be with our appearance, with how thin our bodies are, with, you know, whether or not we have accomplished certain things, whether or not we're in a relationship or have gotten married or had kids by a certain time, whether or not we even choose to have kids. Like all of that stuff, for so long, society has told us that we're supposed to be this. And if we don't fit into that box, well, we're failing. When you think about some of the institutions that can maybe, I guess, create this belief or this standard for women and mothers, wives, whatever, things that come to mind, okay? Obviously, the patriarchy, okay? It thrives on being in control. And part of that control is mind control. No, part of that control comes from causing us to believe that we have to meet these certain expectations. And then when we don't, we feel shame or we feel guilt. And so those feelings become internalized and keeps us from moving forward and just being the person really that we're meant to be, and really coming into positions of influence or power. Because when you don't believe in yourself and you believe that you're not good enough, how are you going to get to such a high level that you have a significant amount of influence and power? Not that power is a bad thing. Power is just in the hands of not good people. It can be a damaging thing. So if we're constantly kept in a position where we don't have power or influence over others, let alone our own lives, that's the entire intention. Another institution, unfortunately, not to say that all parts of this are bad, but religion. I know in my experience, I have been told that a good wife does XYZ. A woman of God does XYZ. And as much as I don't want to disrespect anyone who holds those religious beliefs close to their heart, I think where the problem lies is when we're holding every woman, whether or not she believes in said religion, to that standard. There's too much of a intertwining of normal societal expectations versus what religion says you're supposed to be as a woman, as a wife. Okay? So obviously we have these outside factors that can contribute to whether or not we feel like we're enough. Diet culture is another, I guess, institution that thrives on the idea that you are only good enough once your body looks a certain way, or if you eat a certain way. And this isn't necessarily my area of expertise, but when people say, oh, don't eat like you don't want to be cheap and easy, so don't eat like that. Well, it's really classist because, as I mentioned in one of my other episodes, some of the most impoverished groups in this country are mothers and children. And sometimes they have to resort to non-perishable foods to be able to feed their children. And to shame them or make them feel like, you're a bad mom if you're feeding your kids this. Well, her kids are fed. And she has a limited source of income. Because when you think about it, like I was saying earlier, a lot of times we feel guilt or shame over things that are not objectively wrong. It was just the best choice in that particular moment or in that scenario, right? So if a mom is a single parent and she only has her income, maybe she has to get support from the government, food stamps, Medicaid, whatever, to be able to support those children because maybe their father's not in the picture. That's a whole nother thing. Because really when a mother becomes a single mother, there needs to be less of, well, what did you do to become a single mother? There needs to be more of, what did that man do to you that caused you to become a single mother? And there needs to be more accountability for the absent father than the mother who stuck around and is raising those children and having to do literally sacrifice everything to be able to put food on the table for those children. There needs to be more accountability for them, not the mothers, because they're the ones that stuck around. Let's be real. Now, I will say that if that single mother becomes abusive or neglectful for any reason, there needs to be accountability for her as well. Okay? So, getting back to it, if a mother is a single mother and her only options are, I have to be able to stretch this money out to be able to continue to feed my children so they don't starve, that means that my options are limited to these things. because they are the most affordable. They are within my budget. Mac and cheese, frozen meals, like things that the diet culture will literally make you feel like shit for turning to. But the reality is, what other choice did she have? Right? Like, think about that. Was that really a wrong decision to give her children non-perishable foods? Because the other option was for her children to starve. I don't think we always think about those things. Just a quick recap. So some of the things that can contribute to our feelings of not being enough, that ultimately is tied into our guilt or shame, is the institutions or societal expectations that are placed on us by things like religion or patriarchy or diet culture, things of that nature, okay? Now, there's another aspect of this, okay? And personally, it took some digging for me to recognize this or to realize this, and that is what's going on in your inner world and your inner child. Because most of us were traumatized in some way, shape, or form. And a lot of us, unfortunately, were traumatized by our own mothers. Not to say that fathers didn't also traumatize us, but because mothers have for many, many years been the primary caregiver, and even to this day still are typically the primary caregiver for the children, they were traumatized by that particular parent in whatever way. Even if there wasn't an experience of outright neglect or abuse, trauma can still happen. And a lot of people don't think about that. Like, when they hear trauma, they just think like, well, like, I wasn't abused, or I wasn't like, they didn't hurt me, they weren't verbally abusive. But there's certain things that can happen in your childhood that can create a wound, and literally we literally rewire your brain in a way that it goes into survival mode. It goes into a way of coping to meet a need that was not met, if I can put it as simply as that. So many of us have a wounded inner child, and a lot of us need to heal that inner child. But because of that fact, when we fall short as parents, and I know this has been my case, maybe not for every mother, but I know for me, whenever I have fallen short, it is because my inner child is saying, your mom didn't do this for you, so you need to do this for your kids. Otherwise, you're going to end up being like your mom. And not falling and not providing this need that you needed as a kid. But here's the thing. We are not our mothers. We are us. Okay? And I want to tread lightly, because I don't ever want a mother to hear this podcast and be like, oh, I'm a shitty mom. Like, that is not my intention. Okay? The reality is, even us as mothers who are doing the work, who are trying to heal, it is inevitable that our kids are likely going to be traumatized somehow. Maybe not as traumatized as we were, especially if you are choosing to gentle parent your child, or in other words, another word for it is conscious parenting or authoritative, not authoritarian or permissive, authoritative. A really, really useful page. There's actually two that I want to mention that immediately come to mind. There's a lot of gentle parenting creators, but these two in particular are really great. There's the High Impact Club, and her name is Marcela Collier, I think, Collier, and her TikTok tag is High Impact Club. And then there's the other one, The Indomitable Black Man. He's really good too. He gives really good examples just to like compare the different parenting types, which are authoritarian, authoritative, and what's that one? Permissive. He does really good examples. He also has a book that's on my list of books to purchase, because I do really want to read into that. But regardless, they also do have resources. So I will tag their accounts, their TikTok accounts, and possibly their Instagram if they're on Instagram. I will tag their TikTok accounts in the show notes, as well as on the YouTube description if you're watching this on YouTube. So you can check them out if you're really interested in gentle parenting. But again, going back to this, because I talk in circles because I have ADHD. Okay, so just bear with me. Okay, going back to it. We are inevitably going to traumatize our children. Again, maybe not as bad as we were traumatized, but it's inevitable. But the difference here, remember, is that when you do, if your children come to a place as adults where they tell you, hey, mom, when you did this thing when I was a kid, it affected me this way. It's important to validate them. It's important to acknowledge that whatever behaviors surfaced during their childhood from you or things that you did, whether more often than not unintentionally harm them, it's important to say, you know what? I am so sorry that hurt you that way. That was never my intention, but I want you to know that I apologize. Like, just, it's literally not that hard. It's not. But people who lack emotional intelligence are going to blame shift. They're not going to take accountability. They're going to say, well, I did this and this and that. They're going to turn around and guilt you. So we're seeing that a lot of millennials are going no contact with their Gen X and Boomer parents because their parents don't want to take accountability for how they hurt their kids. The point that I was trying to make is that our inner child will sometimes remind us, or at least, again, in my case, my inner child, when I was feeling like, oh, I have to do this for my kid, it was really because my inner child was saying, hey, this didn't happen for you. So, and you're still hurting, really. It still hurts. So you need to do this for your kids. But sometimes you have to step outside of that and say, yes, it still hurts. I still feel this way. But in this particular scenario, objectively, what is going to be the best option, really, for my kids? And what is going to be the end result if I choose that? So looking at it and stepping outside of your emotions, as I was saying in the beginning, and saying, you know what, if I do this, this is ultimately what's going to happen. So looking at it from a standpoint of like this example that I gave, if you have to give your children frozen food or non-perishables because, well, you just don't have the financial resources to go out and go buy organic food all the time, look at it as, you know what? I am giving my kids the best that I possibly know how. And would it be ideal to be able to give them better foods? Absolutely, yes. Is it always feasible? No, it's not always feasible for some mothers. And I think it's important that we recognize that as mothers, as a community, and I guess just learning to better support each other and uplift each other instead of shaming each other. Because unfortunately, a lot of shaming comes from other mothers, more so than people who are childless, I feel like, personally. But know that if a mother is shaming you, it's very likely that she feels inadequate herself. And so her shaming you is a way of her trying to boost her self-esteem because she feels really crappy about herself in one certain area of parenting. And so she needs that false sense of superiority over whatever issue she is shaming you about to make herself feel just a teensy bit better in that moment, because more than likely, majority of the time, she feels really terrible about herself. And it's important to have compassion for those mothers, but not without calling them out when they are hurtful. You know, not tolerating them saying things and not holding them accountable for that, and not questioning, hey, why did you think it was okay to say that? What made you think it was okay to say that? Like literally pushing it, putting the ball back in their court and saying, hey, that was hurtful. Why did you say that to me? And honestly, some people may stop in their tracks and be like, damn, I didn't mean to be hurtful. If they're emotionally intelligent, emotionally mature. If they're not, they're going to deflect. They're probably going to gaslight you. They're going to turn it back onto you. And those people, quite honestly, they're a lost cause. As much as like, I want to say that we can help each other start to heal, until someone is willing to recognize when their own behaviors are toxic or hurtful to the people around them, no one is going to cause them to change except for them. They have to be the ones to choose to change. And sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom, something like, I don't know, your adult children not wanting to have anything to do with you, to recognize, oh shit, maybe I need to change. Sometimes it takes getting to that point. So all in all, or I guess to close this out, I want to give you an example of maybe a way that you can really start to break down and reflect when you start to feel a certain amount of guilt about something, and kind of my own thought process in doing this. So one particular example that I could give is when I just had my son. My kids are 19 months apart. So I was pregnant back to back. My daughter, I breastfed until 14 months. And I probably could have breastfed her longer, but I ended up getting gallbladder stones with my second pregnancy, and that was extremely painful and ended up actually causing my milk to just dissipate. So I breastfed her until 14 months, and she was exclusively breastfed. She never took a bottle. That was extremely hard. That was, if I could put a word to it, I don't want to say horrendous, but it was not fun. Okay. So nobody else could feed her except for me. Except for, when they're giving her solids, but still, okay, she wanted boob a lot of the time. So my son, on the other hand, he is now 11 months and he is no longer breastfed whatsoever. His first month of life, he ended up getting jaundice, had to be in the NICU. And oddly enough, we had actually taken him home already. And then we ended up having to admit him to the hospital because of that fact. After the fact, because I noticed something was off with his breathing, and so he ended up going into NICU after we had already taken him home, and that was really hard. It was just a really terrible feeling. During that time, they needed to give him formula to help feed him when I wasn't able to get there fast enough with pumped milk, or if maybe I didn't pump enough milk, and I was pumping like crazy. Okay, I would go there as frequently as I could, and my poor toddler is like, well, what the hell is going on? Because I was always with her. So she's like, what the hell is going on? Like, why is my mom gone so much? And that was a very trying time for me. And I'm proud of myself for pushing through that and doing as much as I could to breastfeed my son. And I continued to breastfeed. And it just got to a point where him being on me constantly and having to nurse constantly, it was just too much, on top of trying to take care of a toddler, because she was very active. She's still very active, but it was too hard. I needed help. I needed someone to be able to take over feedings, and I did not have the capacity to sit there and pump all the time, because if I did, my daughter was coming up and trying to grab the hose and trying to pull it off, and whatever. And those like cordless battery pumps are not as good as like the ones where you sit down and it's like attached to your boobs and plugged into a wall. They're just not as good as those ones. And I could not at that time afford one of those like really expensive ones, like the Willow or the whatever the other one is. Those really popular ones are like freaking $400. I couldn't afford those. So I was put in a position where, okay, I need to be able to attend to both of these children. I don't want my daughter to start to resent her brother because I'm always carrying him, I'm always feeding him, and she's not getting attention from me, but I need support. So I decided, well, let me start to supplement with formula when I need it, and then I'll breastfeed whenever I can. And then along came the formula shortage. That was fun. So then I had to eventually wean back onto breastfeeding. It got to a point where I was just getting overwhelmed. And I just felt like I wasn't doing enough. And when I sat down and I asked myself, why do I feel so guilty about wanting to stop breastfeeding? Like, how could I breastfeed my daughter for 14 months and then turn around and not breastfeed my son for the same amount of time? Like, do I love my daughter more than my son? And I had to stop and say, no. Amber, let's think about this, okay? You have already given yourself the reasons as to why it might be best for you to get help with feeding, right? With somebody else giving him formula so I don't have to pump, because as I mentioned, it was really hard to keep pumping with the toddler around. So I really, like I said earlier, really had to step outside of it and like think about, okay, well, why did you choose to do this? Well, it's because of this. Okay. So why did you do that? Well, where are these feelings of like, I'm not doing enough? Where are they really coming from? And when I really thought about it, my inner child was saying, well, you got to do better than your mom did. When I really think about it though, doing better than my mom did involved recognizing and acknowledging when my mental health was struggling, because my mom didn't always do that. Because when I was under pressure, under stress, and not being able to get support, I was less patient with my kids. I was more irritable. I just was not always in a great mood. And so the options were, okay, continue to breastfeed so that my son, can get the nourishment from my body and all of this, right? Build his immunity, whatever. But continue to be irritable, continue to be impatient, not get as much support so that I can't continue to do things that were important to me that allowed me to put my best foot forward when it came to my kids, or give him formula, which is still food, is still nutritionally adequate. A lot of moms formula feed. It is still nutritionally adequate for my son, so he's still being fed, yet I can still give my toddler attention and get support. Once it got to a point where he was holding his own bottle, I could pop him in a little chair, give him his bottle, deal with my toddler. So, and that helped me to feel less stressed, less irritable, more patient with my kids. I was able to take moments out to do something for myself because I could get support much easier without worrying about, I got to make sure I pump it at such and such time so that he can get a bottle of breast milk. And when you break it down like that, in the way that I just did, was it really that bad of an option that I decided to switch to formula? No, of course not. Because I sat there and I thought about, okay, if I continue on this path, what is ultimately the result that's going to happen? Okay, well, if I go in this path, what is ultimately the result that is going to happen? But here's the thing is that takes time to sit there and reflect. For me to be able to come to that conclusion and recognize that, I literally had to journal about it. I had to record. I did a voice recording. That's one of the ways I like to journal. I did a voice recording and literally just talked to myself and talked through that so I could process it. And once I did that, I was like, oh, okay. That's why I'm feeling all these ways. Well, you know what? I'm doing the best that I can. And this is going to be the lesser of two evils, right? Like, this is going to be the best option for me in this scenario with my children, with my family. If I can put it plainly, fuck what everybody else is telling you. Do what's going to be best for you and your family and your kids. It's as simple as that. But it's important to recognize all of the feelings that you're feeling. What maybe are feelings that are coming as a result of things that you have been told, like I mentioned earlier in the episode, or things that you're telling yourself because your inner child is screaming out to you. I think that more or less concludes this episode and really just what I wanted to talk about. But I want to know from you, my listeners, what did you take away most from this? Are you maybe going to stop guilting yourself so much? Hopefully that's ultimately what's going to happen. Are you going to maybe think about, okay, what are some of the things that I believe about motherhood or what I'm supposed to be as a mother that really are just not feasible, are just damn near impossible to achieve? And why do I feel so guilty or ashamed if I'm not accomplishing those things? Is it my inner child? Is it the voice in my head that I would always hear from my own mother, from my own father, that if I didn't do this, then I was a bad kid? Really think about those things. My hope for you is that in doing this, you will feel less guilt, less shame. You can show up and put your best foot forward for your children, but also not get in this cycle of shame and guilt, because a lot of times shame and guilt can lead to self-sabotage, and sometimes self-sabotage can look like resorting to substances or dissociating or not taking care of yourself in whatever way that feels right to you. And if you're self-sabotaging, I want you to think about, if I saw my kid doing this to themselves, would it hurt me to watch them do that? Would it hurt me? Because if it would, maybe it's time to change that behavior, because it's like a constant cycle, right? Guilt, shame, self-sabotage. Then you feel guilty for self-sabotaging. Guilt, shame, self-sabotage. It's like a constant thing. And so until you break that cycle and say, why am I self-sabotaging? Why am I dissociating? Why am I drinking so much? Why am I eating so much? And like not eating in ways that are nourishing my body. I personally do that. I am an emotional eater, and I'll notice that I stress eat. And a lot of times the food choices when I stress eat are not great choices. And then I feel like crap afterwards, and then I have less energy, and then I just don't want to do anything. And like my kids are like, Mom, I want to go outside. So again, in closing this episode, my hope is that you can start to become better aware of the mom guilt that you experience. And rather than just sitting in it and it allowing to turn into that cycle, as I just mentioned, unpacking it and like breaking it down and saying, no, I shouldn't feel guilty about this. What I did was not wrong. It was just the best choice that I had at the time. So if you enjoyed this episode, please go ahead and drop a rating. I always appreciate comments or feedback. You can follow Mom's New Identity on socials at Mom's New Identity on Instagram and TikTok. When I get to it, I will be posting like little clips of just episodes and stuff like that, so you guys can get snippets of that if you haven't seen other episodes. But I slowly but surely am going to be building this community. But I just want you all to know that as much as I care about you and want to create this community for you all, my capacity is sometimes limited depending on what the needs are of my kids. So my only ask of you is that you give me grace if maybe I'm not as quick to engage on socials or anything like that. But again, you can follow me on Instagram, TikTok. My DMs are open. If you want to send me a message, you can email me. I think it's momsnewidentity@gmail.com, or maybe it's moms.new.identity@gmail.com. I don't know. You can always email me if you have questions or things like that. But I appreciate your feedback, and I hope that we can continue to grow together, to heal together, and really just create a different life for our kids, for ourselves, and for the world. Mom's New Identity podcast is written, directed, and produced by your host, Amber Ivana. Intro music, Madre Creator, is written, produced, and performed by Heidi Rojas Music.